Can everybody hear me? Am I speaking into my mic? Yes? No? Almost everybody? Welcome to the first class of adult ed. I feel like it's the first day of school where you show up kind of excited again because it's been summer break, and then about halfway through you remember why you skip adult ed. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Father Armstrong asked me to basically just to talk about my transition to the Anglican Church, which is only a couple of years ago, and then what I appreciate about Anglican worship. So it's going to be fairly subjective, just sort of my experience, not any authority behind what I'm saying, just sort of what I appreciate about the church and what brought me into the Anglican communion. So I thought I'd kind of tell my story at least a little bit. I was born in a Christian household, and we had been, as far as I understand, evangelical. I didn't really know what the word denomination was. For a long time, we attended New Life North and Woodman Church and just sort of understood Christianity as large churches. So my parents both worked in Christian ministries. If you've heard of Athletes in Action, Focus on the Family, Ransomed Heart, and then now my dad and mom do their own thing called The Noble Heart, if you ever want to look it up. My dad teaches a lot on calling and vocation, kind of in relationship to our relationship with God, but really good stuff. So I grew up in Christian home and Christian teaching, but very evangelical. Eventually, sometime in my teens, our family kind of became disenchanted with the church, or at least I should say the evangelical church. And we kind of transitioned into a home church setting with the people that my parents worked with. So sort of had a Christian community that we did home church with for quite a while. And then after that, when I moved to college, I was sort of not attending church much. I did a little bit, which I'll get into, I guess. To CU, University of Colorado in Boulder. So, yeah, not too far away. Yeah, go Buffs. I love that our mascot is misnamed because there's no such thing as buffalo in the United States. We have bison. So that's a good one. But that's okay. I didn't go to football games anyways. But okay, one thing I thought was interesting as I was reflecting on these experiences from like basically mega church, evangelical to tiny little home church, was that I feel like they have a lot of things in common. And I think that they both are sort of a reaction to the structure and the authority of a church like the Anglican Church or the Presbyterian Church, and both an attempt to kind of correct problems that they see with authority, whether that's with thousands of people gathering in a warehouse or a few people gathering in a living room. But let's see. I think the issue I take with both of those structures, so mega churches and home churches, is that what I experienced was that they both become an authority unto themselves rather than in their attempt to kind of correct what they see as an issue. So, for instance, right, the Catholic Church is in the news right now. There's some really serious problems going on, and we look at the authority of the Catholic Church and wonder, like, why is this happening, right? So then you ditch that and you go and you say, well, we'll do our own thing where this doesn't happen, and then suddenly you're a New Life Church and you have Ted Haggard in charge, and you create your own new problems because you've created your own new authority structure and your own new, and then home churches. I don't know if anybody's ever had experiences in home churches, but very similar issues. I've had experiences within that setting as well. I guess my church experience, it just showed me that that attempt to kind of restructure authority in our own way ends up often with worse problems, whether it's major issues like a Ted Haggard or a Joel Osteen or kind of the pseudo cult that ends up coming out of most home churches I've experienced. Not saying that people are not worshiping God in those settings at all, but only that it seems to be more likely to lead away from the straight and narrow, at least from my experience, than the actual structured authority churches. So Yeah, so after that, my first venture back into the church actually was when I was in Boulder in college, attending a small congregation, kind of loosely on and off with some friends, was never very bought in. I was there the Sunday that the pastor announced to the church that he had found a bigger and better church that would pay him more money. I think what he said was, God has called me to a new ministry. But it was that classic experience of exactly what I was expecting, which maybe wasn't good, but that classic, and I'm gone. And he left, and then every week after that, somebody else had a reason that they had to announce that they were leaving the church, and eventually the whole thing just fell apart. So that was kind of my first venture back into the church, out of the home church setting. And then eventually moved back to Colorado Springs after completing my degree, and started attending New Life Downtown pretty much just to meet my wife, Christine. My friends were trying to set us up, and they'd gone there, and she was going there, and so I started attending so that I had a reason to talk to her. But eventually we started dating, and then we're engaged, and what we loved about it was the liturgy, and among other things. I should not speak for her. What I loved about it was the liturgical aspects of it. And what I learned quickly was that there's churches that do more liturgy. I was very unfamiliar with this. I had attended Holy Theophany, which is the Orthodox Church in Springs, Father Anthony, for a little while, so I had some experience with liturgy, but this was sort of my first experience of the Anglican liturgy within the more Protestant-ish tradition. So she graciously said, well, let's try a more liturgical church. And I think the Google search brought up St. George's. So we came to St. George's, and we attended our first service, and we got in the car afterwards. And it's not very often that I have the foresight to ask Christine what she thinks first. But this time, by providence, it happened, and so she said, oh, that was really great, we should go again. And so I decided not to say, that was really weird, I'll never go again. And so we went again, and because I eventually caught up to her and her appreciation of St. George's Anglican worship, and that was a couple of years ago. We've been attended for 3 or 4 years before moving to New Jersey. So that's kind of a quick version of my story and my relationship to the church. But we were confirmed maybe 2 or 3 years into attending here. So some things that have appealed to me about the Anglican Church. Has anybody read C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity? Really, really amazing work. So that book, he sets out to kind of explain what mere Christianity is, meaning basically like universal Catholic Christianity that we can all kind of share our understanding of. But what he explains he says this is different than, say, like worshiping in a church. So I'm just going to read this quote. He says, mere Christianity is like the hall out of which doors open into several rooms, those rooms being churches. If I can bring anyone into that hall, I have done what I attempted. But it is in the rooms, not the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. The hall is a place to wait in, a place from which to try the various doors, not a place to live in. In plain language, the question should never be, do I like that kind of service? But are these doctrines true? Is there holiness here? Does my conscience move me towards this? Is my reluctance to knock on the door due to my pride or my taste or my personal dislike for the particular doorkeeper? So there's mere Christianity, in which I was sort of living, I guess, in terms of faith and belief in God. But then at some point, you have to walk through a door. You have to, whether you're trying it or not, you have to join a congregation. You have to go worship at a church. You have to experience that and partake in that. And if you want to have the meal, if you want to experience the different aspects of it, the music, the various ways we worship. So for me, joining the Anglican Church was sort of that final finding that room that I felt like I was comfortable in, and where I saw the holiness and where I saw the doctrine that I think is true and right. A little note he has, I just wanted to read that I really liked. He said, when we have reached our own room, be kind to those who have chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall. If they are wrong, they need your prayers all the more. And if they are your enemies, then you are under orders to pray for them. This is one of the rules common to the whole house. I thought that was really good. because I can be very judgmental sometimes. So there's things that drew me to the Anglican Church. I'm going to kind of relate it to my college experience. So Lewis, in part, inspired me to finally go to college. I took a couple of years off and was just reading literature and realized I needed to go to school. So I started as an English major. Lewis was a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. But I loved literature, and I thought like this, it was kind of calling me. But it was once I got into school that I discovered the classics department, and that's the study of Roman and Greek history, literature, language, archaeology. And what I had finally come to realize was that all of my favorite authors sort of had in common this classical background. They all sort of seemed to have the same language and understanding of what the conversation that had started with the Greeks and gone through the Romans and really created a foundation for modern literature. And I didn't have that. I didn't have that foundation. So I switched to classics, started studying Latin. I would say Latin is probably the most practical thing I've ever done in my life, despite the fact that it's a dead language. But the things you get, a little plug for humanities, the things you get out of a humanities degree, if you're looking for it, hard work, use of language, thinking, those things I think pay off way more than many other things I've done, but set the foundation for then developing specific skills. So I like to at least preach a little bit for humanities because they get a bad rap a lot, but most practical thing I've ever done. And yeah, okay, I'll stop it. So I switched to classics, and then let me see here. So I guess the relationship I'm trying to draw here is I kind of see the Anglican Church in a similar light. Got my coffee. I kind of see the Anglican Church in a similar way in that it has this deep-rooted beauty and power, and it's been passed down from generation to generation, and I didn't have that growing up in my church experience, and so I appreciated different aspects of worship and different prayers and whatnot, but it was finally discovering the Anglican Church and the Book of Common Prayer and these things that had been written thousands of years ago and passed down to us, and that people from all sorts of cultures and with all kinds of education had been able to use and appreciate, and whose faiths had been deepened. And on top of that, the beauty and the elegance of Anglican worship, I think, is just at another level. And for me, I would much rather be called into something higher than me. So if I'm going to read, I want to read a work that's going to ask something of me, because I already know from experience and from the wisdom of people who have gone before me that investing in something like that, investing in Shakespeare or Homer or Dante or something like that, despite all the work that it takes, is going to pay off so much because they have so much to say and there's so much power in it. So investing in the Anglican liturgy and investing in the Anglican worship, even though the first time you hear some of these words you have no idea what they mean, and maybe you still don't know what they mean, but like that development, I think is worth it. And that's not to say you can't enjoy a TV show, but investing in a TV show is almost nothing like investing in epic poetry or in going to a Shakespeare play. And so I like to compare it to that just because I think the language obviously reflects that heavily, but also just the form of it and what it allows you to do, the way you partake and participate in the Anglican liturgy reminds me very much of what I learned as a college student, of suddenly realizing this whole world was open to me through this hard work of studying a dead language that most people thought was a joke, like if they even knew what it was. So finding the Anglican Church was sort of similar to that for me. Okay, so then another quote. G.K. Chesterton wrote a book called Orthodoxy, another great classic. And in one of the chapters, I'll read this quote from chapter 4. The chapter's called The Ethics of Elfland. But the quote says, "Tradition means giving a vote to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. All members of a democracy object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by the accident of death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our groom, our servant. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father. So there's two things I really love about what he's saying here. So first of all, he's talking about tradition as a sort of a form of democracy. And that differentiation between tradition is not scripture. You don't vote on whether you like scripture or not. You submit to the scriptures. But tradition is, it is something that we participate in, only we don't participate in it as this church decides what liturgy looks like, and then we're going to do liturgy for ourselves the way we want to do it. We're only a small percentage of the entire democracy, which is everybody for 2,000 years who's been participating in Christian worship. And so while we have a voice and we're asked to participate actively, we don't get to sit by passively and just let it happen to us. We have to recognize the humility of our position as the youngest members of this democracy and the least educated members of this democracy. So we're kind of coming in under our fathers and mothers before us who have passed this tradition down to us and getting to partake in that. And I don't appreciate the liturgy. I think we use the term democracy so loosely. That's why the baby boomers and the Gen Xers and after decided to jettison that for newer styles that they were able to understand and they were taught. Yeah, because they don't want to do the work to appreciate it, and they don't want to be told that they don't necessarily have all the answers. They don't want to take that thing that's being passed down to them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is a good transition into my next point. Another thing I like about the Anglican Church is the structure of authority. And kind of to your point, so I was a teacher, I was a Latin teacher at junior high and high school for 4 years. And you learn a lot about authority in a classroom. And one thing that I think that the Anglican Church does well with authority is it recognizes that it's needed and it has a strong presence of authority without becoming a tyranny. And I think it does that. So in the classroom, when a teacher has no authority in their classroom, it either becomes a tyranny of, say, the teacher's emotions or a certain student who knows how to take control, or it just becomes chaos. And it's the teachers who actually have authority, who often you wouldn't expect to have authority when you meet them because they're very gentle humans usually, but who actually know how to take authority in the classroom, and they do that only for the sake of the classroom and for the sake of their students and for the sake of learning, that things actually happen. And I think the Anglican Church sort of does the same thing, where instead of refusing to acknowledge its authority and the need for authority within the community, it takes on that authority. So the priest, the bishop, etc., they take on the authority, but only as much as they need for the sake of the community and the communion. And surprisingly, I think I've seen, at least from my experience, and I haven't been around that long, but my experience, I've seen less tyranny and less chaos in the Anglican Church than I've seen in, say, evangelical churches, or even currently my experience in the Presbyterian Church. Maybe it's just the personalities, but I kind of expected the Anglican Church to feel much more like tyrannical and hierarchical and like, this is what you're going to do here and now. But it seems to me like, because our priests are under the authority of our bishops, etc., and there's sort of this good structure, it allows for the freedom of the people within the church as much as is needed, and then the authority that is there keeps us in check, so that which we need, again, as a student, when you look at high school students, to expect them to learn without requiring anything of them is just ridiculous. There's maybe a couple of them out there who have that in them. But it's a dishonor to most of the students to not be an authority figure in your classroom. And I had a lot of students who really didn't like me during class. And I was always surprised that I don't think a single one, I can think of a single one. I can't think of more than a single one who didn't like me after they were out of my classroom. And it was in my classroom that it was an issue, because it was in my classroom that they were trying to be disruptive and I had to straighten them out. But I had one student tell me he's the worst student I've ever taught. And the next year he was in Latin 3 with my co-teacher, and I walked in to say something, and he said, "Mr. Barkalow, you're my favorite teacher." And it was, what? Like, we would fight all the time. And I shouldn't say fight, but like I had to, he brought out so much of me that I didn't even know I had of like trying to like be strong, and oftentimes it wasn't great. But the fact that he appreciated me after that, and I think it was not because I was this amazing teacher, but because I was willing to take on the role as an authority figure in that room, and not because I needed to prove that I was smarter than him or stronger than him or something like that. He was actually like this tall, but yeah. But so recognizing that, and then also seeing that, I think, in the church as well, where the authority, it gives you that freedom to then learn, and then it protects the students who actually do want to learn, because it gives them an environment. And it turns out a lot of the students who don't think they want to learn, once they're bored enough sitting there quietly, find that learning is sort of interesting, or at least more interesting than what they were doing, and often find that they're a lot smarter than they thought they were when they're not distracted by their own, mouths. So I've really appreciated the authority structure of the Anglican Church, and how careful the Anglican Church is to protect not just that authority, but to protect it in a way that it only supposed to only allow certain people into it, and who are going to be worthy representatives of the authority of Christ, and not abuse that. And obviously, we all know that that's not always the case in the worldwide community of Anglicans, but attempting to preserve that structure. And I think the role of the priest as the representative of Christ's authority and not his own authority. And I think sometimes I've seen that in evangelical churches and home churches and Christian ministries, where a person becomes sort of their own authority because they have so much influence, or they're so charismatic, or they've sold so many books that they really do develop their own authority, and then they start wielding that in a group, and if you don't agree with it, you're out, or whatever it is. Whereas the priest doesn't represent himself at all. He represents Christ and Christ's authority, and so if he's not doing that, he's gone. But when he is doing that, he's not himself. He's sort of this, he's us, and he's Christ at the same time. And I think that's just really the only way for a human to wield authority, because otherwise it all belongs to God, in my opinion. So I love that. Music was something I didn't really grow up with, and it's something I'd like to think could be done so well. It can be done so well in the Anglican Church. I wish I knew how to read music, and I wish I knew how to sing. Had I learned how to read music young, and had I come to Anglican Church every Sunday morning to practice and worship, I think I would be much better. I would imagine. I don't know if this is always true, but I'd imagine I would have a better voice, practicing reading music every day. I think that's awesome. So I think I love that the Anglican Church is willing to do that, take it seriously, and not just put up words on a screen, with the same 3 chords, but to actually give your children and all of us, that experience of participating in beautiful music instead of just kind of mediocre music, and then giving you, by the end of however many years, you can actually have that skill built into you as you worship. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and St. George's is very lucky to have a wonderful music department, so yeah. I wish I was 12 again, sort of, but not really. Eucharist, I love that the Anglican Sunday service is built around the Eucharist. I think it's so good that moment of repentance and forgiveness is central to everything else. And because when you preach in the light of that, or when you listen to a sermon in the light of that, when you sing in the light of the Eucharist, it sort of like washes away anything that isn't God and isn't good, and just allows the truth to come out more. And when it's centralized around that instead of around a good teacher or a good musician or something like that, but it's always centered around Christ, I think that's really important. I love that the homilies are short, both as the listener and as the speaker. And in this book on the 39 Articles, Oliver O'Donovan, he's a professor of theology and an Anglican priest, and he talks about the relationship of the Anglican Church is first to Scripture, and it's second to the teaching. So in a lot of churches, I think, teaching kind of comes first. They might give you a verse, and then they're going to teach about it. But in the Anglican communion, and as in other or liturgies as well as others, we actually hear the scriptures, and the most important thing is that the scriptures are being read, and that we're all hearing them, and that's the relationship of us to the scripture. And then second comes the person who might have some education and spends extra time thinking about it, and can then sort of elucidate, okay, here's what's going on, and maybe reword it in a way that gets the power of the scriptures out to a 21st century audience. But the relationship is first us to Scripture, and I love that. I got really tired of hearing just like one verse and then this person's opinion about it, which usually ends up being a really long story. But I think that's important, but it has to be second to, like, because we're all intelligent enough to read the Scriptures, and the Scriptures are powerful enough to speak to us. We don't need that other thing, though it can be really beneficial. And I think in that sense, the short homily is actually really good and really purposeful, because if it becomes long, it then becomes either more central, or it becomes sort of almost even with everything else, whereas the homily really should only be a short piece of, okay, so you've heard Scripture, you've sung Scripture, you've repented, you've taken the Eucharist, and then I guess that comes after. But here's a little bit of like application and a little bit of rewording of these things so you can think about it again, and then now we're going to go into the Eucharist. The communion of the saints, the sense that we're participating in something that is being done all across the world by people of many, many cultures and languages and traditions, and poor and rich, and you have literal kings in England probably going to church sometimes, I don't know, and literal slaves in some cultures who are worshiping God in the same thing. But the fact that we're all kneeling together, and that we're all saying these prayers together, and that we're all, submitting to Christ together. And of course, that's true in some sense of the whole church, but especially within the Anglican communion, I love that we're choosing to do it with everybody else. We're choosing to do it with Africa, and with the UK, and with Canada, and with South America, and with our ancestors who did it before us. And the fact that we're all we're joining that communion of saints in a very purposeful and serious way, I think is just amazing to think, especially when you kind of get lost in it's easy to get lost in the little infights of our own community, or whether it's, just Colorado Springs and like these different things that happen. The fact that we can then remember that like we're just a small part of this huge communion that's all doing this at the same time. I think that's awesome. I think that's all I have. So I guess if you guys want to ask any questions, you're welcome to. And then, yes, sir. Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in large part it's the liturgical approach to worship that has been kind of reinforced by the lack of that in some ways. I know some Presbyterians are different than others, but there's been a real, in the PCUSA church at least, which is associated with Princeton and the church I've been working at with the youth group, they like to write their liturgical, like their prayers every Sunday, and which is fine, but it's just like, it's always like, you just don't know how to write a prayer, like, like St. Chrysostom did. Like, why don't you just use his? It was so much better. And not that there isn't a moment for that, but it's like they just got rid of all of it. And yeah, I think just that like kind of giving up of that, and it's sort of turned, the worship I've been experiencing has sort of turned into more of like a hurrah for our social perspective, and like, like we love the right people, or we love people, and it's great, but I just don't want to go to church to talk about that. I want to go to church to worship God. And those are things like those prayers that happen, I think we should be praying out of our heart all the time, but not necessarily in that moment. And I think we should be, working towards a better society and caring for people. But, on Easter Sunday, I want to hear about Christ. I don't want to hear about a march in New York City. Like, they just it's sort of missed that. And so, again, that's not the entire Presbyterian church by a long shot, or Princeton, but that was sort of been my experience in the worship. And then, trying to think of what else. I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm a minority now and it feels really good to be like, oh, I'm an Anglican.
But on the other hand, in many Presbyterian churches, while they kind of have a looser liturgy, they're kind of trying to do it from the heart rather than just describe them
Right.
before them.
Right.
I think there are churches that may talk about those things, but I think they also stress the Word of God, family worship,
Mm-hmm.
especially
Yeah.
the smaller ones, especially
Yeah.
the Covenant Presbyterian Church, which requires its church. Family integrated churches mean you can do away with Sunday school. I mean, they're with you all the way.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, if you've heard of Kevin Swanson, I mean, his service can go over an hour and 10 minutes. But
Yeah, another thing I don't like about it.
they do have, but this church does have weekly communion.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
But
Yeah.
you get a long winding service with Kevin, and he really emphasizes preaching and teaching.
Yeah.
But you still have a reasonable liturgy.
Yeah. Another piece that I think I appreciate about the Anglicans is they haven't, we don't seem to struggle as much with the sense experiences. And I love that about the Orthodox Church. There are other things that made it so I just decided I couldn't be Orthodox. But the sense experiences of there's something visual, there's movement, there's taste, there's sometimes smell. I guess we don't really use incense here, but all of those pieces, it's engaging you in all those aspects. And the fact that, if you want to do communion out of a plastic cup with grape juice, fine. But like, if I'm going to be doing communion, I would prefer to do it out of a real cup with real wine, because it just seems like that experience is going to be more evocative and allow me to, I guess, I don't know, get into that experience more.
But there are those who cannot take one due to actual health.
Sure, yeah. Uh-oh. 2 hands. Oh, sorry. Hers was up first. Oh, sorry. I mean, I would say I'm pretty ignorant on the topic of church history, but it seems to me like, I know like schism is necessary, it's going to happen. I can't remember where it is, it's in 1 John somewhere. He talks about like, after he's talking about unity and unity and unity, it's like, well, oh no, sorry, it's Paul. And it's in 1 Corinthians. He's talking about unity and unity, and then he's like, oh, and by the way, of course schism was going to happen, because we had to know that they were not with us. So, as ugly as it is, but like if there's a schism and you go 2 ways, one of them was closer than the other maybe, but like, so I don't understand. I don't see why it couldn't have been the Anglicans. Like why we couldn't be the ones who have tried to stay truest to the spirit of Christ in the church. But obviously that does mean reform, because the Anglicans are sort of the reformed church or something like that. So, I mean, in that sense, I would say that's my gut feeling or my heart towards it. But I haven't actually really read that much about church history, but there's just aspects of the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox that don't seem to me to quite capture the spirit of the church as well as the Anglican worship does. And I love, like the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer is very specific that the liturgy can be changed, and that you can't take that right away from the people, because then you're losing the real worship. It doesn't mean you do change it. It doesn't mean you always change it. There's very specific rules around it to protect it, but it can be changed. And I think that, like that spirit of we do actually have to be involved in this democracy called, tradition. We do actually, there is something expected of us. We don't just sit there and say, this is what they did, so we do it. But you don't just say, well, I don't like this. It's like, well, you're 12. Who cares? Like, like you don't like wine, but that's because you have to actually like develop a palate for that. You don't just like start off liking what's good. I mean, so in that sense, I think having that humility to recognize like, oh, I don't like good literature, instead of I don't like it, it's not good. It's like, well, you probably don't like Homer because you don't know how to read. Like, this is going to take a lot of time. So if you have that humility, but sorry, I got off topic, but yeah. Yes, some. I mean, some. I think most students seem to be much more interested in sort of like, not how does history sort of feed who we are and what we're doing now, but more like, well, how does culture feed? Like, what do we need to do to match sort of what culture is doing right now? So whatever the hot topic is, we need to figure out how we're going to answer that, which I think is relevant, but often lacking that, like, well, church has been around for 2,000 years, and it turns out it's been dealing with these things forever. So, like, let's look back and see how it's been dealing with it and then apply that. But, yeah. Yeah, it was a really interesting course on kind of the philosophy of art and then how that relates to the church. And yeah, I mean, it was very eye-opening in terms of just sort of getting a better understanding of what we're doing when we sing, or what we're doing. Even the liturgy itself, at least this professor described as the enactment of something. So he kind of talked about the philosophy of acting and how when you act out a Shakespeare play, you're not reenacting it. A reenactment would be like a war reenactment where you try to, make it look like it used to look like. You're actually taking it on and living it out, like you are King Lear for that moment. But there might be a million King Lears at the same time and over time, but each one is King Lear, and there's still only one King Lear. But he has to be enacted every time by a different, he's enacted by a different character. And so the liturgy itself is enacting. Every single Sunday we're enacting this thing, the Eucharist. And so it's not a reenactment of the sacrifice or of the service. It's an enacting. It's a kind of a living, taking on of it, which helped me. I'm not describing it very well, but it was really helpful for me to kind of start to get a better grasp of what it was that was drawing me to this liturgical experience. But then, the bringing in of the senses, the purposefulness of the building, the way it's designed, the way it's built, the way it's supposed to call your eyes to certain things and invite you into certain things. I think you can worship without art, but it's sort of out of necessity. And I think we are created to worship through these experiences, and like God gave us these senses to use them, and they're sort of being redeemed, I think, in a certain way by the church, by your experience of worship, singing, visuals, all that. But I could recommend a book. So the professor's name is Gordon Graham, and I think the book is called The Philosophy of Art. He has a couple, and they're really good. Yeah, and he's an Anglican priest from Ireland. He lives in Edinburgh now, but he was great. Okay, thanks everybody for listening. Come back next week for somebody else.